Good morning. This is Rick Tyler, Senior Advisor to the Akin for U.S. Senate. I want to thank everybody for joining the call today. If I could get one response to make sure that anybody's hearing me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. We do have an open line, so I will take questions afterwards. If it gets a little unruly, I'm going to ask you to email justin@akin.org if we can't manage it, because we don't have a call queue. So we'll just try it, and if it doesn't work, we'll do it that way. I'm sure you're all aware by now about David Leib's story yesterday that reported that nearly $40 million in taxpayer money over the last 5 years has found its way into McCaskill's network of family businesses. And that is a matter of record, but I want to take a moment to focus in particular on part of that money which came from the stimulus bill, because I think it's illustrative. Claire McCaskill voted for that bill. Todd voted against it. And in that particular bill, what's interesting is her comments surrounding the bill. First, she said the bill was for creating jobs and stimulating the economy. That's it. We know, as a matter of retrospect, that the stimulus bill was an economic failure. It neither created jobs or stimulated the economy. Second, she's on record as being part of a group who went through the bill line by line. Now, she was a former state auditor. I take that to mean that she was very thorough in her examination of the spending contained in the bill. She went on further to say that she helped remove over $100 billion in spending that she said was part of a regular appropriations process. That is, these spending measures that were in the bill weren't appropriate to, I assume, stimulating the economy and creating jobs, so she helped to remove them. She specifically mentioned that she cut funding for education and veterans. Yet, in that same bill, her network of companies received $966,000. That's not in dispute. I think what's in dispute with her is the scale of how she personally benefited, but I don't think it's in dispute that the $966,000 went into companies that she either owns or has ownership in, and that's an interesting question. I thought it was actually interesting, as late as yesterday, Claire said in her second term one of her goals was actually to reform the federal contracting process. But I'll set that aside. As far as I can tell, the $39 million that was reported by the AP over the last 5 years going to her companies is a matter of record. But her response so far is at best non-transparent, and it's certainly, to me, and I think to most Missouri voters, incomprehensible. Claire McCaskill and her husband have amassed their considerable fortune from taxpayer-funded programs. That's hundreds of them. She's listed by Roll Call magazine as the 9th wealthiest member of the U.S. Senate, yet at the same time, her reaction to the AP story seems to be that she doesn't actually make any money from these contracts. So something doesn't add up. Moreover, she acknowledged that in 2006, that was her campaign for U.S. Senate, this was brought up that it might be a conflict of interest, and that was certainly raised. And she said she would do all that is necessary to make sure there were no conflicts of interest. She said this several times on the record, and at least one time saying, including that she would set up a blind trust if necessary. As we know, she took no steps in this direction. So there are numerous questions that remain that we have and we think Missouri voters deserve to have before they go to the polls in November. Why she didn't divest her interest in these hundreds of companies, there's I think over 200 that are listed that claim something like $200 in revenue or not, just to avoid the conflict of interest claim, but she didn't do that. So there's a question of why she wouldn't have done that. But even if she, but setting that aside, the point, there are actually several companies listed on her personal finance disclosure which receives significant amounts of taxpayer dollars, and where she claims in her own disclosure significant amounts of revenue. So her claim is false on its face according to her own disclosures. There are companies where she claims in excess of $100,000, which I would consider significant, and up to $1 million from these same companies over the last 5 years, and at the same time she's saying she doesn't really make any money on them. Given all of these facts, we are calling on McCaskill in the interest of full disclosure to release both her and her husband's tax records for the period covering her term in the Senate. The disclosure and her public statement simply don't provide the full picture for voters deserve to know, particularly in these economic times when 1 in 6 Missourians live in poverty and many others are struggling, that voters should know why her companies got $39 million, and while at the same time she's claiming she doesn't make any significant income from these companies. And Missouri voters deserve to know whether Claire McCaskill, member of the U.S. Senate, has her interest over that of the Missouri voters. And with that, let's try to open this up to questions, and we'll see how that goes. And if it doesn't, we've got a solution.
Hear me? I'm Amy with 41 Action News.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can barely hear you, but go ahead.
I know, I can barely hear you too. Sorry about that. I'm from Kansas City. Can you just concisely explain how she benefited? What the worst part of this is to you? Is it that she didn't?
Well, I think the worst part is you have
family personally made money off of them.
Well, I find that curious because in many of these companies, her husband Joseph Shepard is listed as the general partner. Many of these cases, the LLCs are owned by other entities that are also owned by Joseph Shepard. I've seen that. I've seen the paperwork on that with his signature on it. So I assume when you own a company that you would benefit. People don't go into business to not make money. So clearly, if she has an interest in these companies and that she's making money and that money is taxpayer money, that people at a minimum deserve to know that. And we know that $39 million, and as far as I know, before yesterday, I don't think any Missouri voter was aware that $39 million of taxpayer money went into companies that she either owned or had an interest in. So I think at a minimum, voters should know that when they go to the polls and decide for themselves. Look, I could be wrong. I mean, people could say, gee, we're out here struggling, living by the rules. We have a small business trying to make ends meet, trying to pay for gas, food, education, our housing and electric bill. But gee, we'd like Claire McCaskill to get more of that taxpayer money into her account or into her businesses. Now, they could certainly decide to do that. I don't think that's the case. I think that people would like to know that she has a personal interest in federal contracts that result in taxpayer money going to her accounts. And so in the interest of full disclosure, and in 2011, she says, if public dollars, I'm quoting her now, if public dollars are involved, it needs to be transparent. And these are not transparent. And in particular with the stimulus bill, she said she cut education and veterans, and yet her companies benefited $966,000 in what were non-compete contracts. And she was also on record as saying we should have competitive contracts. Stimulus bill didn't contain them.
So the bottom line for you is that she's making money off of taxpayer dollars.
The bottom line for me is that Missouri voters should understand that her fortune is amassed from taxpayer dollars. So the question is, does she have the Missouri voters' interest in mind? That is, 1 in 6 are living in poverty. Many others are struggling to make ends meet, where she is reaping the benefits of $39 million in taxpayer money. And I think voters would like to know, have that piece of information. I think that's disclosure is the bottom line.
They've released 3 ads today, all of whom I believe are women who used to vote, who have never voted for Claire McCaskill, and describe themselves as pro-lifers. What do you say about that? In these last 30 days, has the mudslinging really started to happen? Well,
let me say that Claire McCaskill has plenty of money to run ads, and I find it interesting that she would release 3 ads the day after the AP disclosure. This is simply a tactic to divert our attention away and divert voters' attention away from the fact that she has been caught in a Washington insider game, and she's of course going to do anything to distract that, including having the press write about these ads and not writing about the $40 million of which her companies received. That all of that money was taxpayer money. That's all that's about.
Joe Manis, St. Louis Beacon.
Hi, Joe. Go ahead.
Hi. As you know, I did a pretty detailed story late last night on this. They are contending that the profit that's listed on his financial reports on these projects primarily came from the units in those buildings that were not subsidized. And they're saying that particularly in the case of the USDA subsidies, which is $36 million, that money has to be segregated and used only for improvements to the buildings and can't be used as profit. Is that how you see it, or do you see it differently?
Well, of course I see it differently. On the one hand, if you're a general partner of a company and your company receives tax subsidies, you don't get to parse out how much is profit and you made out of your salary. Okay. The second point is, I'd like them to explain. I'll give you 4 examples. Cambridge Manor in Madison, Florida, received $147,000 in federal subsidies last year. They declared between $15,000 and $50,000 in income from those properties last year. So is that one of the properties she claims is not federally subsidized, in which she makes $15,000 to $50,000 in profit? Carriage Gate of Palatka, Florida, received $160,860 in subsidies last year. She, again, claimed between $15,000 and $50,000 of income. She may think that's insignificant. I don't think most Missouri voters would agree. Putney First LP in Putney, Vermont, received $180,000 in federal subsidies last year. She declared between $50,000 and $100,000 in income in that property. Again, is that a property that didn't receive federal subsidies? No. Is that a property where she didn't receive significant income? No. Wynwood Development of Cairo, Georgia, received $86,000 last year in federal subsidies. She declared $100,000 to $1 million in income. So there again, she's received federal subsidies, and there's a significant revenue stream from that. She could probably, out of the 317 LLPs, corps, and LLCs that she has listed in her personal finance disclosure, she could probably pick out a few that aren't federally subsidized. But the fact remains, $39 million went into, from both HUD and the Department of Agriculture, went into her companies. And there's a discrepancy between what she claims she makes and that nearly $40 million. The only way to get to the bottom of that is to disclose the tax forms, and let's see who really owns these companies. This is conjecture, so I'm going to stop and make sure everybody understands this. This is conjecture and speculation on my part. I don't know the answer to this, but I will posit that there's the possible answer to this is you could say, I only receive a small amount of income from this particular LLC that received this particular amount of money, but those LLCs could be owned by other McCaskill Shepherd interests, including LLCs. LLCs can be owned by other LLCs, and where they have a controlling interest in the LLC, yet they try to say with a straight face that that one company that received the subsidy, we only own, less than 5% of that. So I don't know that to be true. You can't find out whether that's true unless they decide to release either their tax returns or their K-1s in the case of corporations.
Is the congressman releasing his tax returns?
The congressman has not released his tax return more than the public disclosure allows. His taxes are not the subject of inquiry here, but I think we could safely say that if Claire McCaskill and Joe Shepherd were to release their tax returns over the last 5 years, I'm sure that the Akins would be glad to disclose their income taxes for the last 5 years.
This is David Leib at the AP. Why shouldn't Akin just go first? Why should he say, I'll release mine if you release yours? Why shouldn't he, if he's calling on her to release her tax returns,
well, David,
release his first?
You already know the answer to that, because if we release tax returns, people can comb over, nitpick, and say whatever they want about the tax returns. But again, Todd Akin's tax returns aren't the subject of an inquiry here, and they weren't the subject of your story. $39 million of taxpayer money going into their companies is the issue here, and there's a discrepancy between her public statements and her disclosures that do not explain how that $39 million is spent and how they personally profit. Let me just say that They want us to believe they don't make any money, yet she's the ninth wealthiest member of the U.S. Senate. They want us to believe they don't make any money, yet she formerly owned a jet, which she had to sell because they were obfuscating how they owned it, and then they ultimately had to pay $300,000 of taxes, for which she wrote a check. They want us to accept that they don't make any money on these 300 companies that receive $39 million, yet they live in a house that is valued in excess of $2 million. So I think that's all fine. They can own jets and have cars and live the 1% luxury lifestyle, which their supporters decry. That's all fine with me. But the question remains that it just doesn't add up.
I mean, so far, anyway, that's another story. Personally, I think this is an.
Hello, I'm sorry, I'm having. If you would start over, I could not hear you. Hello?
And it is not like he's just coming up with something. This then kind of falls into like a pattern with her husband and family. You know, the same thing last year and now this. They own something like 300.
I didn't catch the first part of your question because I wasn't able to understand it, and I apologize for the technology. Could you start over with the question? I apologize.
The only thing that I'm going to say about it is, and I'll do the chief.
Hey, Rick, I don't think that person is actually asking you a question.
Oh,
Yeah.
This is David Lee, but
I can hear you fine, David.
Yeah, let me follow up on what Joe.
We're getting bleed over from another call.
Yeah. Can I follow up on what Joe was asking and see if I can phrase this in a different way?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what McCaskill's campaign has asserted is that these federal subsidies they've received for their low-income housing developments go into a special account that's used for the maintenance and the operation of the low-income housing units. Some of those housing developments also have apartments that are non-subsidized, and so what they are claiming is that the profit we show for those housing developments doesn't come from the federal money. It comes from the private sector money that is generated from those housing developments. I think that's what she was asking. That's what they've asserted to me anyway, and I think that's what she was getting a reaction from.
Yeah,
well,
David said it clear.
Okay, well, I just listed 4 companies where that's clearly not the case. But that's a little like saying somebody who works for the government who goes through the McDonald's drive-through to buy a Happy Meal, that McDonald's doesn't make any money off of the food stamp recipient or whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous. But money is fungible. Do they set aside the federal money and that money it goes toward nonprofit and then they make all their money? The fact is, none of their business models that I see and understand make any money without a federal taxpayer assistance. So I just think that's just a false assertion on its face. And they could prove that, I think, very easily if they would release the tax forms, and then people could see how they derive their profit.
Rick?
Yes.
This is Joe Manis again. Question: Is the congressman going to be saying anything himself on this, or is this considered something that it's better for the staff to handle?
The congressman has spoken out about this in a public meeting last night, and he will speak about this, as far as I know, from now until November. I think it was last night on KOMX, he actually suggested that the McCaskill Shepherd release their full tax returns and put it behind them.
Now, does your campaign plan to run any ads about this?
I wouldn't rule it out. But what I would say I don't have anything to announce on that, but what I would say is we are taking steps now to make sure every Missouri voter knows before they go to the polls that McCaskill Shepherd were in receipt of $39 million of taxpayer money during her 5 years in Congress, which she did nothing to avoid either the appearance or the direct conflict of interest that we're asserting she has.
Really?
Yes.
This is Bruce McDaniel from St. Louis Public Radio. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So as you were saying earlier, you said that this would be fairly easy to parse out as long as McCaskill released her tax returns. I'm just seeing this tweet from Caitlin Legacki from the McCaskill campaign saying that she already released her tax returns this year. So if that's the case, are you satisfied? I haven't had a chance to
know
if that's
yes,
true or not.
We know that, and what I've said clearly is that Joseph Shepard, her husband, and she's on record as saying that they share assets, so these are their companies collectively. He should release his tax returns because her tax returns don't answer the gap here in what I've already articulated, the gap between the money they receive, their wealth, and the assertion that they don't actually make any money. It doesn't add up. By the way, I don't think it would be easy if he were to release his tax returns, and I hope he does. I don't think it would be easy to figure this out. When you have 317 LLCs, this is complicated by definition. LLCs, LPs, and corps, to be clear. So if that's the end of the questions, any other questions? All right, I'll wrap it up. I appreciate your time. Take care. We're always available for questions. I'm at rick@akin.org, or you can call me on my cell, 703-431-3350. Take care.